Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistonomy. In mainstream media, the debate around the China-Pakistan economic corridor often ends up being about are you a patriot or are you a traitor, with those who ask critical questions or talk about different issues with the project being labeled as traitors or agents or something else. I invited Dr. Tayyab Safdar, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Virginia, to talk about the China-Pakistan economic corridor, whether it is indeed leading to a debt trap for Pakistan, and what are the issues that Pakistan must deal with to fully maximize the opportunities presented by the China-Pakistan economic corridor. This was a fascinating discussion where we talked about China's geopolitical ambitions, the relationship between the two countries, and how and why China prefers dealing bilaterally with countries behind the public eye and scrutiny. If you like our content, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel or the podcast, and do share with your friends and family. Here's Dr. Tayyab Safdar. Dr. Safdar, welcome to Pakistonomy.
Thank you, Zaid. How are you?
I'm doing well, and thanks for taking out the time today. I know it's early morning for you and for both of us, actually, but this is an interesting topic, so I'm looking forward to the discussion. I want to jump right in and start with this question that, in mainstream conversations in Pakistan, there's this dichotomy, right? That either you are pro-CPEC or anti-CPEC, and if you're pro, you're a patriot. If you're anti, you're a traitor. And in the last few years, that debate has picked up, particularly also led by comments made here in the United States about Chinese debt trap in business press around the world. Malaysia, for example, did similar things with Dr. Mahathir Mohamad when he came to power a few years ago. You've done research on this from both the BRI lens as well as the CPEC lens. And we saw in CPEC phase one, when Pakistan invested heavily in large road networks, power plants, that yes, those were needed investments, as Pakistan debt also went up significantly. So tell us a bit about CPEC and how do you see it? Is this something that is ushering in a new debt trap for Pakistan, or is this something in between where Pakistan needs these investments but really can do a lot better with what it's doing right now in terms of how the corridor is structured?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question, and you're very right. The time that I spent in Pakistan, it does emerge as it's either you're for this or you're against this, and there's no nuance either in the popular media or in a lot of the academic work that comes out on the topic as well. One would expect that having been 5 years old, there's a little more nuance that sort of enters into the conversation, but that's not happening, and that's partly because of the geopolitics surrounding CPEC as well. So initially, if you look at the long-term plan of CPEC, the period from 2015 to 2020, or the early harvest phase, as it's called, was supposed to deal with some of the supply side bottlenecks that you've identified, right? You dealt with the transport infrastructure, improved the transport infrastructure, and secondly, you dealt with the crippling power shortage that affected Pakistan, since 2009, if not before. So those were that was the plan, and if you look at how it's evolved, it has dealt with the power shortage to a large extent. One can always, sort of have a conversation about whether it has done it in the most efficient manner, but they have dealt with the power shortage, and that was the one point agenda with which the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz actually came into power. Now that those supply side, sort of issues have tapered off, much of the current account deficit that was initially, sort of that went up quite substantially because of these investments has tapered off as well. I think this whole debt trap, sort of thesis is problematic at multiple levels. At least in the case of Pakistan, there are a lot of sort of structural weaknesses that affect the economy. You've got the twin deficit, you've got the fiscal deficit as well as the current account deficit, which has been a perpetual problem as far as Pakistan is concerned. You've got weak growth in exports. You have perpetual issues with foreign reserves as well. So all of these problems, these structural issues, sort of combined, that had therefore the new government had to actually go to the IMF as well. the issue, and I'll give you some examples of how the lack of nuance there is. So, for example, in 2019, at the Woodrow Wilson Institute, Alice Wells, who was the chief, diplomat dealing with South Asia, one of the statements that she actually made, and I'd just like to read it, is people in Pakistan are beginning to ask tough questions about CPEC and the kind of deals that their government struck with communist China, and what Pakistan really gains from this sort of a relationship. Similarly, a 2020 book which recently came out by Siegfried Wolf, who's based in Germany, asked some really interesting questions. So his conclusion is CPEC reduces economic freedom, is geopolitical as opposed to economic, gives rise to corruption, debt trap, loss of political sovereignty, and presents a challenge to the rule-based international order. So those are the kind of, that's the kind of discourse that's surrounding CPEC, at least in the international, sphere. Now, the debt trap, thesis is problematic at multiple levels. One, if you look at Chinese sources, there's a lot of literature on this as well. And Wang Yi, the foreign minister from China, has often said that CPEC is the flagship project of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? So the Chinese say that it's the Belt and Road Initiative. So whatever happens in CPEC matters for them. So they would not want it to be seen as something which is ensnaring a country into a debt trap, and they do not want to, take over the assets that are, linked to those sort of investments.
In a way, CPEC is not Pakistan is not Sri Lanka, and Gwadar is not Hambantota. If one were to summarize what the Chinese foreign minister is saying, that we won't be doing the same things or in the same manner, to say the least, in terms of what went down in Sri Lanka. Would that be a fair statement?
I think that's thank you very much for bringing Hambantota as well, because that is the poster boy for this whole debt trap thesis. And there's emerging scholarship that actually challenges this whole view about Hambantota as the debt trap. So there's a 2020 paper that's been done by Deborah Brockingham, who's at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, and she strongly questions this whole notion of the debt trap diplomacy, and she actually calls this as the debt trap meme. So for her, this whole discussion about China taking over Hambantota forcefully or by force is extremely problematic because, as with Pakistan, Sri Lanka had issues. The change of government brought in, a different set of priorities, and in order to, deal with the pressing foreign exchange issues, the government actually, negotiated this sale or this lease of Hambantota through to this Chinese company for 99 years. So this is problematic, and there's a lot of emerging scholarship that actually challenges this whole view of the Chinese forcing countries to take up these loans and then to take over. So in the case of Pakistan, in the case of the power sector, for example, there's a 2019 paper study by Columbia, the Center of Energy, by Erica Downs, that actually questions this further. And they said, so the question that they try to answer, or she tries to answer, is whether this is a diabolical scheme on the part of Beijing to actually ensnare Pakistan into a debt trap and to take over these assets that are being built, or whether this is a problem as far as part of the structure of Pakistan's electricity sector is concerned. And her conclusion is that it's highly unlikely that Beijing actually wanted to ensnare Pakistan into this sort of a debt trap, and it's a function of the internal weaknesses of Pakistan's electricity sector, which includes providing sovereign guarantee-based returns, which includes the circular debt, which is this huge problem which continues to afflict the power sector. So there's a lot of emerging scholarship that actually questions this whole debt trap narrative. The problem with the debt trap narrative is that many of these countries, so for example, if you look at the World Bank's research, which came out from 2018 to 2019, many of these countries that initially started off with these Belt and Road Initiative projects had weak fundamentals, just as Pakistan did. So therefore, when you had many of these projects kicking in so quickly, the absorption capacity of a lot of these countries was limited, which meant that the overall debt went up, which then led to multiple issues as far as the economy is concerned. And in the case of Pakistan, we've seen that we had to go to the IMF. Again, going to the IMF is not something which is rare in the case of Pakistan.
It precedes the China-Pakistan economic
Exactly.
corridor as well, right? But I think the debt trap point is interesting, and just wanted to add something here as well, that it wasn't just Alice Wells or the United States or folks sitting in Germany or elsewhere raising that point, right? Then opposition leader Imran Khan, now Prime Minister, talked about debt trap. Then opposition leader, former finance minister, and now planning minister Asad Omar used to talk about transparency for CPEC. And so you had commerce advisor Razak Daoud famously quoted in the Financial Times that led to Bajwa's visit to China, talked about slowing down CPEC. So it came from within Pakistan as well. And so, and my point and many others also raised that point within and outside Pakistan, was that taking on debt in and of itself isn't bad. If you're a college student going to college and getting an MBA, let's say, that's not, you're taking on debt, but that's not bad debt. But if you're that same 22-year-old who is borrowing on a credit card to buy a Mustang, that is bad debt, right? And so there's a debate that must be had on that. But my question to you on that was that, the power deals Pakistan did sign, and there was talk about IPPs and renegotiating with Pakistani IPPs to reduce their ROI and returns. Similar negotiations have to occur ultimately with China as well. The circular debt is out of control, and it has to be reformed, not just by paying it back the way Nawaz Sharif did in 2013, 2014 by raising debt, but you have to deal with the chronic challenges within the sector. Do you think, from your research and your analysis of how China behaves, that Chinese investors and the Chinese government will renegotiate these power contracts, and will that be an easy negotiation for Pakistan?
So I don't think there'll be easy negotiations as far as Pakistan is concerned. And that's also a function of the fact that you've been doing something in a particular way for the last so many years. You're since the mid-1990s, you're used to these IPP contracts where you've been given these sovereign guarantees, you've been giving extremely high rates of return. So the view from Islamabad as far as the power bureaucracy is concerned is that, we're not able to attract investment if we do not offer certain guarantees. So therefore, for us, it's a problem as far as getting investment is concerned. So it's not as if we want to give these sovereign guarantees or we want to give these exorbitant rates of return. It's just that people do not want to invest in that country. Now, as far as China is concerned, as I said earlier, I completely agree with you. As far as the problems are concerned, the rates of return are high. They're indexed to the US dollar, which means that whenever there is a bout of depreciation as has taken place over the last year or a year and a half, the cost of electricity goes up. Even if it's the cheapest source of electricity, which is hydropower, for example, if it's 7 cents with the ROE, sort of pegged to the US dollar, whenever there's going to be depreciation, the cost of electricity is going to go up. So there is a definite need to renegotiate some of these contracts. As far as Beijing is concerned, I would think they would be ready to negotiate. The problem, I think, is that there's a lack of understanding about how these negotiations, sort of take place. For better or for worse, the way that the Chinese system works is that it's a bilateral, negotiation away from the public eye. So the lack of transparency that you allude to is an issue as far as the way that things are done in the case of China and its relationship with many of these countries.
And just to quickly interject that from what I'm hearing from you is that the lack of transparency is not because of some nefarious reasons. It's just a function of how China functions in its bilateral relationships, particularly around the BRI.
Yes, so not only in the BRI, so again, I'd go back to the literature. So, for example, if you look at again Brautigm's work on Africa, and there's a new paper that's just come out from their work, they talk about how the renegotiation takes place between countries on a bilateral level, away from the public eye, because that's the way that the system sort of works. And again, because they have quite a comprehensive database, their research actually shows that in all of these processes of renegotiation, in the case of Africa, there has never been there have never been efforts to actually take over assets or sort of go towards arbitration or anything of that sort. So it's handled amicably at a bilateral level. Now, that's not to say that the Chinese are not sort of tough taskmasters and there's not a tough negotiation process that takes place. However, there are precedents of these sort of renegotiations taking place, and I would not be surprised if if those sort of renegotiations take place as far as CPEC and these power projects are concerned. Because at the end of the day, the problem, as you rightly alluded to, is that you took all of this money, you developed all of this infrastructure, you expected the economy to take off for whatever reasons after you put in this excess capacity into the system, which has not happened. So now you're saddled with a lot of capacity and the offtake is not taking place. So what do? You either renegotiate these contracts, you either go towards a longer time horizon as far as the sort of debt component of these deals is concerned, or you just say I can't pay. So I think that,
and again, I think, and
yeah.
Sorry to interject again, but I think again, from just being a student of project finance and large infrastructure projects, that renegotiation or the need for that is not anything unique, right? I remember in grad school studying the Polish highway being financed by the European Bank, and the assumptions were flawed, and then the project was executed, and you had to renegotiate the debt payments, and you had to renegotiate the ROE and everything around the financing of the project, just because the traffic that was expected to be on that highway was not there. So somebody had to then renegotiate, right? So it's not that it's just a unique phenomenon in terms of the Chinese deals that have been signed.
Exactly. So looking at those sort of factors, those sort of the historical precedent, as well as the relationship, the importance of CPEC, I do think that renegotiation is going to take place sooner or later, and it should take place sooner. And I'll just give you an example. So on this whole notion of the debt trap and everything. So one of the things that's actually sort of written as far as Chinese investments in the power sector is concerned is that the Chinese were very concerned about the circular debt. So one of the things that they actually wrote down, and it's written in the official documents, is that there's going to be a revolving fund, and the Chinese IPPs are going to be paid earlier before everyone else. That has not happened. So the two power plants that have been operating for the longest, which includes Sahiwal and the Port Qasim power plant, they have, by some estimates, they had not been paid for between 3 to 6 months. That revolving fund never came through. The Chinese government did not actually get involved in at least initially, to get the payment through to these power plants, despite the fact that these were state-owned enterprises that are a part of these that actually operate these power plants, and eventually, the Pakistanis start paying them between 6 to 9 months later. The problem again is when you pay late. Within the 2013 power policy, there's an inbuilt clause which says that you are going to pay the IPPs KIBOR plus 300 basis points, if I'm not wrong, or 150, between 150 to 300 basis points that you're going to pay in terms of sort of late payments. So while the IPPs did get higher returns, the Chinese did not, sort of call in that whole option of declaring, sovereign, whatever, default, which they had were well within the right to do. So it's, as far as the power sector is concerned, it's a mess. It has to be dealt with. I do think that the Chinese firms that are involved will be receptive to a discussion, but I think again it has to take place in a way which makes both sides comfortable. I think this whole getting things out into the open and then trying to renegotiate has its advantages as well, because it puts pressure on the other side. However, it creates ill will as well, in my opinion, which is problematic as far as the long-term, sort of relationship is concerned. And when I allude to the long-term relationship, these investments will start making sense if you have more productive investments taking place in the economy. For those productive investments to actually take place, we've been told over the last 5 years that you will have these magical special economic zones that are going to be built throughout the country, and then the Chinese enterprises will come and invest in these countries. If you want these Chinese firms to actually come in and invest in these special economic zones, you've got to sort of have a better sort of a relationship as far as these negotiations are concerned.
Yeah, I think you don't want another Shah Mahmood Qureshi type comment on the OIC type thing, right? And then have the chief of army going to Saudi Arabia. That would be unproductive and sour the relationship, at least in the short term.
Yeah.
I think I agree with you on the SEZs part. I just, my perspective on this also has been that you also have to be creative about how do you develop your country in the 21st century, right? So, for example, you mentioned there is excess power capacity. You talked about this on the podcast with a couple of other guests as well. But that capacity can be either utilized through higher growth led by, for example, SEZs that make things, or it can be used by electrifying your vehicle fleet, right? And providing incentives to it for electrification because you have excess capacity. And it's about, you need clean air in Pakistan. Smog in Lahore, Karachi is a known phenomenon. And so I think the policymakers also have to rethink and reimagine what development looks like, because at least my view is that the China model of development or the Vietnam model of development as being this global exporter that then brings in foreign exchange reserves and accelerates your growth is not going to work, particularly in a post-COVID world where we have remote work, we have emerging technologies, 3D printing, etc. And countries like the United States and Europe are rethinking their dependence on global supply chains, right? So Pakistan, again, it's again similar to the power sector dynamic. The internal cohesion has to be there in terms of how does Pakistan develop its economy for the betterment of its citizens.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I completely agree with you. There has to be a rethinking of the development paradigm as far as Pakistan is concerned. And there is a lack of, as you rightly point out, there's a lack of imagination as far as what sort of things could actually work. I would disagree a little bit on the supply chains and the reshoring taking place. So that is most definitely going to take place as far as Europe and US is concerned. But at the same time, China is going to emerge as this whole, sort of massive market as well. And the China-Pakistan Free Trade Agreement, the second one, sort of gives a certain advantages to Pakistani exporters to actually take advantage of this market as well. So I do agree to a certain extent that there has to be a rethinking of how you use this excess capacity. But I do think that given the challenges as far as Pakistan is concerned, with the young population, with the youth bulge, etc., there has to be a focus on sort of taking advantages of industrialization, perhaps not in the same way, but in a more Pakistani way of the way that things evolve. The problem again is that the state has to take a very active role in making these policies and then in implementing some of these policies as well. In the case of Pakistan, the state's capacity to actually implement many of these, even if you've got the best policies on the ground, you need someone to actually implement them. Those capacities have actually hollowed out over, especially over the last two to 3 decades, I would say, as we've had these issues as far as state-owned enterprises are concerned, massive privatization is concerned, etc., etc.
So your point on China emerging as an economy that Pakistan can sell to and trade with is very important. It's a good segue to sort of the next part of our conversation, where I wanted to get your perspective on sort of BRI within South Asia or Greater South Asia, and then BRI writ large, right? So if you look at historical trade linkages in the subcontinent, they've been east-west. Pakistan and CPEC is north-south on the axis, right? And connecting the Middle East into Xinjiang, etc. And recently, there have been reports of the Chinese trying to negotiate a much, much bigger deal than CPEC with the Iranians. That has caused concern, not only here in Washington, D.C., but in New Delhi as well. Foreign Minister Jaishankar just stopped on the way in Tehran on the way to SCO and met with the Iranian foreign minister, and they reiterated their commitment and their relationship. How do you see this emergence of this potential Iran-China deal, and how will that link up with, Chabahar linking up with Gwadar and the regional trade nexus that the Chinese are trying to, or at least indicating a desire to build?
So I do agree. I think that the east-west sort of flow of trade has historically been important, and it's going to remain important. So we can't sort of not address it. And I think having all of this investment into this transport infrastructure, if it takes place, will require that you develop these sort of east-west linkages as well. As far as this whole, the Iran-China deal is concerned, it's not been signed, of course, as yet, but there's strong indication that it will. And it geostrategically, in terms of Pakistan, of course, you've got China, you've got India out of Chabahar, so it's something to celebrate. Again, those linkages between China and Iran are important as far as Pakistan is concerned, because it could provide the route for the traffic, whether it's the flow of Iranian oil from Iran through to Xinjiang, or the flow of goods. The flow of goods, of course, is contingent on many other factors as well. So the short answer, in terms of geostrategic, the advantage that it gives Pakistan, it's there. In terms of the long-term benefits, as far as CPEC is concerned, and the emergence of these regional trade linkages, I think the jury is still out there. There are lots and lots of pressures. We don't know how America is going to respond to Chinese companies that actually enter into the Iranian market. How they're going to circumvent or deal with the American sanctions that are in place on Iran, how that's going to happen, and how that's going to affect their operations here in Pakistan, whether they actually go through with much of the investment. Because there's an alternate route as well, right? So if you look at Iran, they can go through Central Asia and then get to China as well. So does it make sense to actually go through Pakistan to actually transport the goods and services that they're trying to export through to China? And this deal is going to be heavily contingent on the flow of natural resources from Iran through to China. So which route does that actually take? That is an important question as far as Pakistan is concerned. Now, on the question of the ports, on the question of Chabahar versus Gwadar, again, Gwadar is an interesting case study, because a lot of people in Pakistan actually say that the natural radiation zone from Gwadar is not aimed at Pakistani market as such, right? So it's aimed at traffic that will generate from Central Asia and Xinjiang, which then goes to Gwadar. And there have been questions because, whether the Central Asian states most definitely have the capacity to actually, be seen as important markets as far as Gwadar is concerned. So there are those questions.
And really quickly, I think the interesting example for Gwadar was, I think it was 2 years ago or something, if I remember correctly, when they did one convoy that went up north and then came back south. And the funny thing that was not covered particularly in depth in the media was that while the goods came in and the containers were full of goods going up, they had to fully complete the journey. They had to send empty containers down south because there wasn't anything to flow down and
Yeah,
out from Goa. They're primarily because of the point you're making, right? It's like, what goods are you trying to sell on the way out
exactly.
from that? Because Pakistan is an importer, exports are either focused on the Karachi route out, or there
Exactly.
isn't nothing else to sell to
Exactly.
the rest of the region.
Exactly. So as far as Gavadas, at least the short to medium term is concerned, developing that sort of the traffic is going to be problematic. The strategic importance of Gavadar, of course, is there. Um, Chabahar, on the other hand, and again, if you look at the larger plans as far as Gavadar is concerned, the idea is to have transshipment facilities over there, some sort of assembly to deal with the kind of problem that you have rightly identified. That you have some sort of traffic that goes out from Gawandar as well. Of course, the Afghan transit trade is now taking place through Gawandar to a certain extent as well. But coming back to the point about the competition between Chabahar, or the cooperation between Chabahar and Gawandar, I think it remains to be seen how Chabahar is actually developed by the Chinese now that the Indians are out. I don't think they'll probably want to have competitive, sort of ports right next to each other. They'll probably want something different from both ports. It remains to be seen how it evolves, because, as I said, the deal has not been signed as yet. There's a lot of conjecture on how things will evolve. But Iran does give certain advantages as far as which aren't there in the case of Pakistan. So if you look at the human development indicators, for example, they're better in Iran as compared to Pakistan. It's a more affluent society in terms of economic, sort of prowess as well. Education levels are better. So those advantages, politically, one can argue that it's a little more stable as
It
far as
has natural resources to
natural
export.
resources, of course, that's the elephant in the room. But I mean, apart from the natural resources, there are other advantages that
Yeah.
Iran offers as well. But of course, the major problem is that how do you circumvent U.S. These sanctions on the country, and how do you ensure that your firms do not get affected, especially now that Chinese state-owned enterprises, a lot of these firms have the ambition to grow globally as well. So would they want to, or do they want that additional headache of dealing with the US's ire as well, especially since there's a cross-partisan support in Washington on controlling China or dealing with China. So those risks remain as far as the Chinese are concerned. So on that bit, I think it's going to be an interesting
Yeah.
few years, as especially now that
I would say that the one point I would disagree with you on is that I wouldn't count India out from Chabahar just yet. I think the Iranians are playing an interesting game as well, where my view at least is that they will watch what happens here in the US in November, and if there is a change of administration, is there an opening to go back to JCPOA and get back on the table? And they will use that to negotiate, at least from their perspective, a better deal, either from the Chinese or from the Americans or both. And you are right, the sanctions issue is real. For example, before the JCPOA, the sanctions were at their peak and India wanted to buy energy from Iran, they had to firewall off their companies and have a swap agreement and do it very tactfully, even though the United States was unhappy with that. But they had to firewall these companies to make sure that they weren't hit by the sanctions that were coming their way. But I think the end of the year and early 2021 will be interesting wherever the election goes, because if Donald Trump comes back, then for sure the Iranians are going to go in the Chinese camp. If there's a Joe Biden administration, there might be an opening to realize, and the Iranians may take advantage of that, to play the Chinese against the Americans and the Indians and say, well, we can go either side. Let's see who offers the better terms.
Well, that's true. That's true. That's a very good point that you raise. Most definitely, and the interesting thing is that a lot of these things are actually fluid, right? You've got no permanent friends or enemies. It depends on how the situation sort of evolves. And that's so the earlier just. Linking it to the earlier discussion that we had, I think the statements that came from Ellis Wells, for example, on CPEC itself, actually help Pakistan or improve the negotiation power of Pakistan as well, because it's up to the Chinese to actually raise their game as far as these investments are concerned. And you're right, it depends on how US, the host economy, actually use these opportunities to improve what we're getting out of that whole relationship.
Yeah, and I want to quickly, speak coming back to Pakistan and where things are now. There's talk of Xi Jinping coming back to Pakistan towards the end of the year. At least there are indications of that. Back a few years ago, Khurram Hussain famously, published Joint Coordination Committee's CPEC 2.0 plans, which are about agricultural investments and things like that.
Exactly.
And at that time, Ehsan Iqbal was like, no, we're not doing this. This is not secret. But everyone knew that, it would make sense. It would make sense to go down that route if you were China and if you're Pakistan as well, because agriculture, for example, needs a lot of investments. Where do you see CPEC going from here on out now that the early harvest phase is over? What are the opportunities for both countries to invest in Pakistan? And what are some of the challenges and risks that you see that Pakistan in particular must navigate to make sure that the promise of CPEC is fulfilled for the economic development and betterment of Pakistani citizens?
So the biggest challenge, I think, is the geopolitical bit as well. How do you balance the discussion that we were having earlier about the Iranians and their wish to balance, their own interests versus the US versus Iran and China? I think that's going to be a major risk as far as whichever sort of administration comes in power in Washington. I think that's going to be a major sort of balancing act as far as Pakistan is concerned. On the domestic front, I think, again, the discussion that we were having earlier about how do you, now that you've got all of this investment in, or all of these projects now built, how do you use them in the most productive fashion? I think that's going to be a major challenge as far as the Pakistani policy making or policymakers are concerned. In terms of FDI, for example, we've been touting the fact that FDI has been going up. For example, we went to $2.5 billion even last year, despite all of the problems. But what sort of FDI does Pakistan want? What sort of FDI is the most important as far as Pakistan is concerned? Because again, there's a lot of literature out there which talks about how different types of foreign direct investment have different sort of effects on the local economy. Much of the FDI that we've been witnessing over the last 2 odd decades has been market seeking. So you look at banking, you look at telecommunications, you look at the power sector, it's been market seeking, FDI, which sort of wants to tap into this, the massive, domestic economy that exists in Pakistan. On the other hand, if you look at, you gave the example of Vietnam earlier, if you look at the examples of Southeast Asia and, other countries that have been successful as far as the export-led model of development is concerned, they've been able to attract a lot of FDI, which is efficiency seeking, right? That you become a part of global value chains. Again, the terms in which you become a part of global value chains is again open to debate, and we can talk about that if you want. But they've been relatively successful in terms of tapping those sort of value chains, which has not been the case as far as Pakistan is concerned. So if promote these special economic zones, because you've had experiences with developing export from EPZs as well in the past, and industrial estates, etc., most of them have been abject failures. So what is going to be different this time? If you
we want to build more of them, even though the last ones are not as successful as they should have been.
Exactly. So that's one of the most important questions. What is going to be so special in these economic zones, which is not going to repeat the problems that you had with your EPZs or with your industrial estates, etc. And I think that conversation has not taken place as far as the Pakistanis are concerned. My whole discussion during the time that I was in Pakistan, I think that part has not been thought through very well, which is a function of multiple factors, and we can talk about them, which are related to Pakistan's domestic political economy.
What are some of those? And I want to quickly jump into that because that's an interesting discussion worth having as well. And the reason why I do that is because, for example, I was in Pakistan last summer, and this was in Karachi before and during the rains came. They were not as bad as this season, but the city was still underwater.
Yeah.
And I had to go to site, and I had to drive to site to meet someone to talk about some biodegradable jute bags that they were making, right? And I go to this area, and this guy has a small factory. He's a small business owner who exports a decent amount of goods to Europe and has had, I spoke with him and he was like, yeah, we've had an uptick in demand from Europe because they're switching away from plastic bags and they're interested in jute and biodegradable cotton stuff, etc. So he was, optimistic about the future, but the drive in was painful. And I was just thinking to myself, both on the way in and on the way out, like, imagine this is an exporter who's not super big, but there are big factories around all over, you can see. Just the truck that comes in and goes out is slow, inefficient, the repair costs go up, the driver wages go up, everything, all the costs at a micro level associated with that are up, which makes your export uncompetitive. Like if you compare it to Vietnam or Bangladesh, which is a straight highway you get out, right?
Exactly.
And so that was just one example that I thought of, was like, how are you going to export from your industrial site to the port to the rest of the world when the journey, which should take 30 minutes, takes an hour and a half just because of the poor quality of the roads and the infrastructure around. So from your perspective, what are some of these issues that domestically constrain Pakistan's ability to be an export powerhouse?
So the one is the incentive structure that you alluded to in part. If you look at the incentive structure and the way that it's evolved, especially again over the last 10 to 20 odd years, there's been this implicit, sort of focus on developing the unproductive sectors of the economy as opposed to, sort of focusing on developing the productive sectors of the economy. You give the example of Bangladesh as, the emergence of Bangladesh as an export powerhouse is extremely interesting and offers a lot of policy lessons as far as Pakistan is concerned. You have to have this focus on tapping these international markets, and there has to be a consensus between the various stakeholders. So Bangladesh is not the most efficient public sector. It does not have the most efficient public sector in the world. They've got problems with corruption. They've got problems of a very fragmented political economy as well. However, they've been able to grow because there is at least this consensus between different stakeholders that this is the route that we need to actually take, going forward, if there has to be some sort of a sustainable development, sustainable in terms of the long term or short to medium term, having growth rates is concerned. That sort of consensus is missing as far as Pakistan is concerned. Couple that with this whole incentive structure, which is geared towards the more unproductive sectors of the economy, lack of long-term credit, a political economy which is not favorable to sort of focusing on exports apart from platitudes, etc. Rent seeking is a massive, and again, there's a lot of literature on how there are different types of rents as well, and rents are not always negative. But it again sort of links to this whole incentive structure that you're generating for the economy as well, or for those who are engaged in the productive sectors of the economy.
I'll pause. I'll interject here. You mentioned rent seeking, and I want you to dive a bit deeper into this because, in a way, in the Pakistani discourse, rent seeking is often equated with corruption, and there is overlap between the two. But what you said is actually going to have people up with pitchforks coming at both of us, because I've written about this as well, is that when you look at the literature, high rates of corruption do not equal to low rates of development and growth. And you said something similar where rent seeking is not always negative.
Yep.
But just give a couple of examples of what this rent seeking is in the Pakistani context, and can it be the grease often in other societies that moves the wheels of the economy forward?
So I'll give you, we'll come back to the example of the power sector, for example. When you give in the case of Pakistan, in the case of the power project that you've negotiated since the mid-1990s, and there's the report that just came out as well, sort of talks about this as well. When you give guaranteed returns indexed to the US dollar, these high rates of return, etc., you take away the incentive of the investor to actually be more efficient, or to invest in longer term projects. If you look at the earlier projects that came in online, for example, oil, etc. So you've created an incentive structure which is actually extremely problematic as far as sort of having the investor move towards a more efficient sort of productive system are concerned. Similar is the case, for example, with sugar. We have this whole sugar issue that's come out. Sugar is a classic example of a rent-seeking sector of the economy. Whenever there's a glut of sugar in the market, the exporters or the sugar manufacturers take the pretext that we have to pay the farmers. We're not able to do that, so we need to export this sugar. And because they're not competitive in the international market, therefore, they need some sort of subsidies from the government to actually export this sugar.
And speaking of consensus, it is probably one of the only sectors in the Pakistani political economy where there's political consensus on subsidies when they're needed.
Exactly. On the other hand, when one talks about productive rents, for example, one looks at the examples, and there's a lot of historical literature out there from South Korea, for example, learning rents. You give people the capacity, because there's from the literature one can see that learning or incorporating new technologies of production, etc., is not a frictionless process. There's a learning process that's associated with it, and there's a risk that the individual entrepreneur is actually taking. So how do you create those rents in the market for that learning to actually take place by your sort of entrepreneurs? So those sort of rents are there as well. Similarly, if there's someone, there could be performance-based rents. The East Asian economies, especially South Korea, is a classic example of those performance-based rents as well. So one of the things that they did quite effectively in the 60s and the 70s was that rent was associated with getting capital at lower rates as compared to the market. So those exporters that actually met those targets, the targets that were set by the government, got that subsidized credit. On the other hand, those exporters that did not, sort of meet those targets, however powerful they might be, they did not get those below market rates of credit, which was so important for them to actually expand. So you've got all of these examples of such productive rents that are out there. Sadly speaking, that's not happened in the case of Pakistan. Aptima itself, or the textile market, textile lobby itself, is partly to blame, but there's partly to blame as well, because they've had multiple incentive packages that have come in, that have been implemented. The quality of implementation one can sort of always debate about, but it's created these perverse incentives that I've talked about, and changing that incentive structure is going to be extremely difficult. How do you create those incentives for people to invest in learning? You gave the example of the biodegradable stuff that the manufacturer was making. So those are growth markets that could be tapped. But how do you create those incentive structures for people to actually tap into those to those growing markets? How do you deal with the risks associated with those markets? Right now, if you look at the power sector, for example, and you look at some of the largest players in the market, many of them were actually associated with the manufacturing sector, and they've now sort of moved to the power sector, because again, it's the incentives that are there. It's those guaranteed returns, it's those dollar-based returns that you're giving. Again, one can debate on liquidity, etc., etc. But in essence, those contracts are the way that they are. They're backed by sovereign guarantees. They're backed by US dollar-based returns. So all of those, sort of guarantees might be important, but they create perverse incentives.
Yeah, and I think the big example that comes to my mind is like your incentive structure right now is aligned towards the Malik Riazes of the world, who can occupy land of poor villagers, and then the Supreme Court can give its tacit approval, say pay 400 billion rupees and you're done. Whereas the incentive should be that 400 billion rupees that this guy has captured from stolen land should be put in productive assets, like
Yeah,
at least the ones that build export capacity, because that's what
exactly.
Pakistan needs. And that's
Exactly.
the biggest, example one can think of the negative rents and the incentives in the
Yeah.
economy.
Yeah. So this whole focus on real estate as the only way forward. So I don't know, about Karachi, but if one goes uh, to Punjab, the discussion that one has across the board is, that society is coming up. It's so lucrative. You should park your money over there or something of that sort.
Yeah.
So that is a major problem. Again, linking it back to CPEC or the second phase of CPEC. If there is some sort of, and that's a big if, change in the incentive structure, if there is, more productive investment that comes in, and there are linkages with the local economy, which have been missing in the case of many of these foreign direct investment projects that we've seen in the past 2 decades, then, you slowly begin to change the way that people are attuned to doing work, and you begin to sort of build that productive capacity, or catch up in the parlance of sort of heterodox economics. If that does not happen, then what do you do with all that investment? I think it's going to remain a big question mark.
And I'll just, one quick correction on that at least in a lot of the investments, quote unquote, that have come in Pakistan, the problem is that they're not risk capital investments. These are primarily linked to sovereign backed loans, which means that if you don't do what you're describing, eventually you will be in a debt trap, right? And it's not unique to China. Pakistan was in a debt trap when the Paris Club debt was restructured back in 2001, 2002 by General Musharraf after the war on terror. Pakistan has gone to the IMF multiple times before China was involved in the economy in the way that it is
Yeah,
now. And
yeah,
really, the question is for Pakistan and Pakistan's policymakers and elite internally to realize that if they're going to continue down this path, then there is disaster up ahead. And it is, in many instances, at least if you look at the human development angle, Pakistan is behind sub-Saharan Africa now in many cases, right?
yes.
Because of the poor performance of the last 2-3 decades. So I think that really is the internal cohesion must be there. And again, it has to be there at the macro and the micro level. For example, I'll go back to that manufacturer of jute bags, right? He had a shipment returned back to him because he had used styrofoam in one of the handles of the bags. And he did not know that that sort of meant that you were no longer biodegradable or not. And no one was there to tell him about that. And again, if you're going to promote your export at some level, at the micro level, the government and the state, going to your point about state playing a bigger role, has to play a bigger role in things like that to make sure people understand what the quality dynamics are, what the standards are, what do you need to do to sell to future markets, not the markets of the past. And I think that's been primarily missing in the Pakistani context.
No, I completely agree. So the role of the state and facilitation, and thank you for bringing up that HDI as well, because that's one thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about. So again, if you were expecting, or if there was an expectation that the early harvest phase would be there, and then you would have 5 years of industrial cooperation, which are now going to start whenever they start, there had to be some sort of investment in developing the human capital around it as well, right? So just having a youth bunch itself does not mean that you're going to be able to take advantage of the demographic dividend that comes with it. There has to be some sort of a thinking about how you're going to, sort of equip people with the tools to be productive, sort of members of the economy. That has not taken place. So if you look at the technical and vocational education that's taken place, or the technical and vocational education to a large extent, it's all geared towards exporting surplus labor to the Gulf or to other countries. It's not geared towards developing people to take advantages of these sort of opportunities as they emerge. And that's been one of the most abject, in my opinion, failures that's taken place. And that's something that's consistent over time. That's not something that sort of any policymaker or any government has actually been able to focus on in a meaningful way. Again, I think when we're talking about incentives, how do you generate those incentives to actually invest in many of these projects, which are apart from brick and mortar that we used to, and how do you create those sort of those sort of learning capabilities as far as the local economy is concerned and local your youth are concerned. I think that's one of the major questions concerned, because that is going to be an obvious problem once if a lot of this productive investment does come in.
Yeah, and I think like I was looking at data yesterday. If you look at UNESCO's data for Pakistan in terms of literacy from 15 to 24-year-old age bracket, going back to your point on Youth Pulse, it's about 73, 74%. The same statistic for Bangladesh is 94%. And that's just total, right? And then if you look at women, Bangladesh is much ahead than Pakistani women. And lo and behold, you understand how and why their garment sector came up, because it was primarily driven by educated women with basic literacy skills who could work in factories and be employed, and Pakistan does not have that. So even if you bring in those investments, well, if your younger labor in particular, cannot have basic literacy skills, then what are they going to produce is a question that we need to answer.
No, I completely. I've been talking to some people that I know in the textile market, and that is a major issue as far as they're concerned. How do you incentivize? How do you get people to work? But it's also that I know that it's. But I wanted to make this point. It's also a lack of imagination, because our and you alluded to this it as well. But it's also lack of imagination as far as end markets are concerned. Exporters remain focused on the Western market, on exporting to the US and to Europe, because that's their comfort zone. I've asked quite a few people after CPFTA2 whether they've sort of looked at this further. There's a wonderful study that the Pakistan Business Council actually came up with as well, looking at the tariff lines and which projects Pakistan could take advantage of. And of course, COVID hit after that CPFTA2. But there's not been a lot of work that's actually been done by major exporters in thinking about how they can take advantage of the CPFTA2. So it's also a weakness as far as the Pakistani entrepreneur or industrial class is concerned as well. This lack of imagination, both from a product angle as well as from a market angle, I think needs to evolve. And as you rightly pointed out, the state has to play a role, an increasing role in it as well. And it's not that the state is doing a favor to anyone. If one looks at multiple instances of where successful long-term growth has actually taken place, the state has taken a more active role or in terms of industrial policy, in terms of picking winners, in the case of East Asia, in the case of China, for example, or in facilitating by providing access to information, as you pointed out in the case of the styrofoam and that exporter. That is not the case as far as the Pakistani state and its role in the economy is concerned.
Yeah, and ultimately, and I'll jump to asking you about some book recommendation. I'm mindful of time as well, but the one point that I always I've increasingly come back to now is it pays better to be operating as an economic agent in Plotistan than in Pakistan. And so in a way, what you're describing are things that entrepreneurs should be doing, but the incentives are skewed in a way where investing in Bahria Town files and DHA City files or the next housing development files has a better ROI than, trying to figure out a new market and making things and running after refunds and things like that, because it's just painful. It's hard work compared to the other, and the returns are higher on the other side as well in financial terms as well.
I completely agree. I think that's an apt description, Plotistan.
Yeah. So on that note, you've done fantastic research on BRI and CPEC, and a lot of people ask me every time I forget, you didn't ask for a book recommendation. So what are 2 or 3 interesting books that you would recommend that listeners pick up and read to understand not only CPEC, I would say, but China's global ambitions or what China is trying to do both economically and geopolitically?
So there's a 2009 book Martin Jacques, and it's called "When China Rules the World." I think that's a good primer to actually start understanding what it means for China to actually evolve and become one of the biggest or the most important economic actor in the world, and how that is different from the Western conception of development to a large extent. I think that's sort of gives you a good sort of background. Then Bruno Matthias's Belt and Road initiative, I think that's a good read as well. Again, these are easy reads, which sort of gives you an idea of why it's happening, what's happening is actually happening. And if one wants to, sort of look at it from a more historical angle, I think Peter Frankopan's study on the new Silk Roads is wonderful as well. On a more critical, sort of a view of Chinese investments, I think there's loads of books out there. But one stands out. I think Terry Brown's CEO China Inc. Is an extremely interesting read. Once again, very easy to read. I think that sort of gives one a more, sort of critical view of China and how global political economy evolves, etc., etc. From a historical perspective, I think the historicization is actually missing, and I think there's a wonderful book. It's a little voluminous, but I think it's important to understand the sort of the way that the Chinese system evolved. Is Deng Xiaoping's biography by Ezra Vogel. Ezra Vogel's based in Harvard. That's a wonderful read, and I think the discussion about special economic zones, pragmatism in terms of looking at different sort of models to actually reform. The kind of insights that you get from there and how the Chinese systems actually work, I think, are wonderful. For those who are looking at it from a more scholarly perspective, again from a Chinese perspective, which is missing in the broader debate, there's a handbook on the BRI which has been co-edited by Kai Feng and Peter Nolan. That's written by scholars from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So all you're going to get through that thick volume is views from the Chinese, view about the Belt and Road Initiative, about these various corridors, etc. So I think those books should help.
Well, that's an amazing list, and I think I'll definitely start with Deng Xiaoping's biography, because that pragmatism of the Chinese is something that at least Pakistanis can also learn from. For example, they don't recognize Taiwan, but China and Taiwan trade ties are phenomenally strong, and there's a lot both China and Taiwan has gained, even though they're in a state of enmity, among the two people. Yeah. And so there's something to learn from that pragmatism as well. So Dr. Safdar, thank you so much for joining us. This was a fantastic discussion. I think we're going to have you on again, maybe once we have more color on where Iran and China are going and the US elections have gone, because that will ultimately change the contours of what China and how China operates in the region and around the world. So thank you for your time, and this was wonderful.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's been an absolute pleasure. I'd like to come back whenever you call me as well, time permitting, of course. Yeah. Thank you so much for that.